I didn't go looking for him. 5 months had passed since the day my manager walked out of the office with a cardboard box and a smile that said he'd gotten away with everything. No dramatic escort from security, no shouting match in a conference room. Just a mutual separation email from HR and a stale tray of cookies in the break room. On paper, it was a restructuring. In reality, he'd driven a project into the ground, buried the evidence in approvals, and left the blame sitting neatly in my lap and on my team's shoulders. My name is Ethan. I work in risk and operations for a mid-sized logistics company, which means I'm the guy who stares at spreadsheets until patterns stop lying. My manager's name was Blake. Blake loved calling himself Big Picture. What that really meant was he approved things he didn't understand and let the details fall on whoever was standing closest. Usually me. The last 6 months before he left were a slow-motion car crash. We'd launched a vendor consolidation project to cut costs and streamline operations. Blake's words, his presentation, his bonus on the line. He pushed through contracts that skipped basic controls. He signed off on overrides without documentation. And every time I flagged something, he'd pat my shoulder and say, "Don't be so dramatic, Ethan. We're an agile company now." Then the invoices started drifting. Numbers that were supposed to be clean suddenly had extras tucked in. A few hundred here, a few thousand there. Always urgent, always pre-approved. I did what I'm paid to do. I documented. I sent memos. I kept my own copies. Blake did what he does. He forwarded my emails selectively, trimmed my reports, and, in one particularly impressive move, attached my spreadsheet to a deck where my conclusions were softened into bullet points that made him look like the hero. He blamed delays on my risk obsession in front of the regional VP. He joked in a meeting that I'd marry a calculator one day. Everyone laughed. I smiled like it didn't land. Then I stayed late and fixed the numbers he'd just broken. When the board finally noticed the cost overrun and the vendor complaints, Blake presented a slide with 3 bullet points: unexpected market shifts, legacy process issues, and internal miscommunication. The miscommunication was me. I knew it. He knew it. HR pretended not to. 2 weeks later, he was pursuing other opportunities. He left with a severance package, a LinkedIn post about new chapters, and a reputation that somehow didn't sound like the guy who'd set a project on fire and handed me the extinguisher without the pin. I stayed. I stayed because someone had to untangle what he left. Someone had to explain to finance why the numbers didn't match the decks. I rebuilt the workflows. I renegotiated with vendors. I sat in too many meetings where people said, "Well, at least we caught it before it got worse," and no one said Blake's name out loud. By the end of those 5 months, the mess was mostly contained. The project wasn't pretty, but it wasn't bleeding anymore. My team trusted me. The VP trusted me. I slept like a man who'd done the work and accepted he'd never get the credit. I'd mostly filed Blake away in the same mental folder as bad landlords and high school bullies. Annoying chapters, not main characters. So seeing him at the market that Saturday afternoon felt less like fate and more like a glitch. I was in the produce aisle, arguing with myself over whether to buy the expensive berries, when I heard that laugh. Too loud, too practiced, the one he used when he wanted a room to pivot toward him. I turned, and there he was. Same polished haircut, same casual blazer over a weekend button-down, as if he'd rolled off a recruitment poster. He was standing by the self-checkout, scanning items and talking on the phone like nothing in his life had ever gone off script. "Yeah, they're still using my framework," he was saying. "They'd fall apart without it. I'll send the latest file tonight." My chest didn't tighten. My hands didn't shake. If anything, I felt quiet. You don't realize how much noise a person makes in your head until they're standing 10 feet away and your brain doesn't flare up. It just observes. I watched him for a minute. He bagged his groceries, still on the call, still talking like the world was organized around his calendar. He didn't see me. Why would he? In his mind, I was a footnote in a transitional period of his career journey. I could have walked away, paid for my food, gone home, told Ray about it over a beer, and had a good laugh about how small the city is. Instead, as he pushed his cart out into the parking lot, something shifted. Not sudden revenge, not some movie-style rage, just a slow, deliberate thought. You never actually vanished, did you? He headed toward the far end of the lot. I followed at a distance, pushing my cart like I was just another guy walking to his car. He loaded his bags into the trunk of a silver SUV I didn't recognize. No company logo, no stickers, new plates. He ended the call, checked his phone, and glanced around once. Bored, not suspicious, before getting in and pulling out. I could have turned my keys and gone home. I didn't. Instead, I slid into my own car, started the engine, and kept 2 cars between us as he left the lot. The route he took wasn't toward the nicer suburbs where everyone assumed he'd retreated to recover. He cut across town, past the office district, through a strip of light industrial buildings, then into a neighborhood I only knew from driving through it on the way to site visits. I told myself I was just curious. Curious where a man like Blake landed after torching a project and skating out clean. The streets got narrower, quieter, small houses, older cars. Not the type of place where you'd expect to find a man who used to brag about tasting 8 different kinds of champagne at a networking event. He turned down a side street I'd never noticed before and pulled into the driveway of a single-story house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Nothing about it said executive. Everything about it said hiding. I parked half a block away, angled just enough to see. He grabbed 2 bags from the trunk and walked up the path like he'd done it 100 times. No hesitation, no checking an address. He unlocked the door with his own key. Not a rental, not a visit, a routine. I sat there in my car, engine ticking as it cooled, and stared at that door. This wasn't his wife's house. Blake's wife loved posting their open-plan kitchen with the massive island and their wine wall. I'd seen every corner of it on social media. This place didn't have a wine wall. It barely had a straight gutter. He disappeared inside, the door shut. The house went still. I should have left. Normal people don't follow their ex-managers home. They complain to friends, make jokes, move on, but there was a feeling I couldn't shake. The same feeling I get when a number on a report is off by just enough to be wrong, but not enough for anyone else to notice. Something here didn't match. His exit, the missing files no one could locate, the vendor who stopped returning my calls right after he left. I cut the engine, pocketed my keys, and stepped out of the car. If anyone had asked why I was there, I wouldn't have had a clean answer. Just this. For the first time since Blake walked out of our office, I had the chance to see where the trail actually went. And I was very, very tired of loose ends. The street was quiet in that way only older neighborhoods manage. A kind of settled silence, like everyone inside had already chosen their problems and wasn't looking for new ones. I stood there for a moment, hands in my pockets, watching the dim shape of Blake's silhouette move behind the curtains. He paced once, twice, like someone checking rooms. Then the lights shifted deeper inside the house. I walked slowly toward the place, not close enough to look suspicious, but close enough to see what mattered. The house wasn't abandoned, but it was worn. A loose shutter tapped in the breeze. The porch steps were darkened from years of rain and shoes that never cared about them. And the mailbox, tilted, dented, had a name scratched on the side, not his. Roth! Blake's last name was Carver. I felt that small, precise tug in my chest, the one that shows up when a detail refuses to fit. He wasn't renting. This wasn't a weekend spot, and he definitely wasn't visiting family. Blake talked about his pedigree more than his actual work. The light in the front room flickered. I stepped away before I could be seen and circled the block. There was an alley behind the houses, barely wide enough for garbage trucks, a couple of old sheds, a fence repaired with mismatched boards, a broken basketball hoop leaning against a garage. I stopped behind the house. A sliver of light spilled through a crack in the blinds. Inside, Blake set the grocery bags down on a small kitchen table. Not the marble island he used to brag about. He took out simple things: rice, canned soup, generic cereal, a loaf of bread with the store label ripped off but still obvious. Not performative poverty. Real downsizing. I watched him rinse a mug in the sink. His shoulders were curved, not squared, like he used to hold them in the office. He looked 10 years older. And then he did something that made my stomach tighten. He reached into the cabinet and pulled down a file folder, one of the thick accordion binders accountants use when they're hiding something in plain sight. It was red. Our team used blue. Finance used black. Red was unusual. He set it on the table, opened it, and began sorting through the pages with the same careless confidence he used when he used to skip entire approval chains. Except now his hand shook. I couldn't see the papers clearly, just shapes, forms, statements, printouts with grids. But one thing stood out: a stapled packet with a watermark I recognized immediately. Our vendor audit template. My jaw tightened. He didn't leave the project behind. He took it, but that was just the beginning. I moved back when a dog barked down the alley. A porch light snapped on 3 houses away. I stepped deeper into the shadows, letting the moment settle. There were explanations. He could have kept old files out of habit. He could have been consulting. He could have had a legitimate reason. But people with legitimate reasons don't hide in cheap houses under someone else's name with red folders and trembling hands. The next morning at work, I tried to focus on the backlog. Emails, approvals, vendor follow-ups, all the usual noise, but it all blurred around the edges. My mind kept replaying that flicker in the blinds. Around lunchtime, Dan, my foreman on the wrist side, knocked on the frame of my cubicle. "You look like you're cheating on your spreadsheets," he said. "Just thinking," I answered. "That's what worries me. Thinking never shows up alone. It brings friends." I considered brushing it off. Dan was good at reading the room, terrible at ignoring what he read. "Did you ever wonder why the board moved so fast when Blake left?" I asked. Dan folded his arms. "Fast? They kept it quiet, but I wouldn't call it fast. They didn't audit his approvals. They didn't want to embarrass themselves. That's not speed. That's shame. And the missing vendor variance files?" He shrugged. "Blake was sloppy. Maybe he deleted them. Maybe I archived wrong. Maybe. But it sat wrong. We went through the rest of the day normally, but after clocking out, I didn't go straight home. I drove past the little house again, slow, casual. A different car was in the driveway this time. A dark sedan, no plates on the front, out-of-state style. I parked down the street and watched. The front door opened. A woman stepped out, not young, not old, professional posture. She had a small leather bag on her shoulder and papers tucked inside a folder. She locked the door behind her, with a key. She'd been inside with him. She walked to the sedan, got in, and pulled away without looking back. I memorized the partial plate. Blake came out 2 minutes later. He ran a hand through his hair, rubbed his face, and looked like someone who'd slept 3 hours too few. Then he turned back inside quickly, almost nervously, and everything clicked. He wasn't just hiding. He was meeting someone, regularly. Someone who carried documents. Someone who walked with the stance of a professional accustomed to confidentiality. Not a therapist. Not a realtor. Not a friend. Someone who worked with information. The next day at work, I checked one thing. Quietly, carefully, using the tools I was legitimately allowed to use. I looked up the vendor consolidation ledger for the quarter. Blake left. A number blinked at me. A disbursement logged on his last week. Small enough to miss, large enough to notice if you were paying attention. A payment to an external compliance consultant. We didn't hire external consultants in that project. It was internal only. I checked the linked invoice. The attached file was missing. Not misplaced, not archived. Deleted, manually, with no metadata left behind except a timestamp on the ledger entry. A timestamp that matched the exact afternoon he'd asked me to step out for air during a meeting. A timestamp that matched the window when I wasn't at my desk. A timestamp that matched him. My chest went cold. He didn't just sabotage the project. He funneled something through it. The woman with the sedan wasn't random. The red folder wasn't a coincidence. The cheap house wasn't temporary. He was running something through that property. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling tiles. For 5 months, everyone had acted like Blake was gone. He wasn't gone. He'd simply moved the problem out of the office and into a house with peeling paint and the wrong name on the mailbox. And I hadn't even seen the worst part yet. I didn't sleep that night, not from fear, not from excitement, from the kind of clarity that shows up when too many details finally point in one direction. The house, the woman, the missing invoice, the red folder he guarded like oxygen. Blake hadn't left the company. He'd relocated the risk, and the worst part? I'd been the one cleaning his tracks for months without realizing it. At the office the next morning, everything looked normal. People warmed their oatmeal in the microwave, chatted about weekend plans, argued about the thermostat. Ordinary life, stable, predictable. I sat down at my desk with the quiet understanding that none of this was stable anymore. Around noon, my VP, Carter, stopped by my cubicle. "You're unusually focused," he said. "I'm catching up," I replied. He raised an eyebrow. "You caught up 2 weeks ago." Carter wasn't the type to pry. Former Navy, calm eyes, a mind like a locked folder, but he had instincts, and my instincts were waking up too. "Walk with me," he said. We stepped into the hallway. Neutral space. No microphones, no glass walls. Just carpet and air. "You think something's off," he said, not asking. "I know something's off," I corrected. "With what?" I hesitated. I couldn't tell him about following Blake home, not without sounding unhinged. "With the way the vendor consolidation files ended," I said carefully. "There are missing documents, unexplained disbursements, and activities that don't match the project timeline." He studied me, not suspicious. Calculating. "What are you really asking, Ethan?" "Whether Blake's departure was actually voluntary." Carter's jaw shifted just slightly. "That's not a productive question." "Maybe not," I said. "But it's the right one." For the first time in months, someone didn't dismiss me. He didn't confirm anything either. But in the corporate world, silence is a language. He clapped my shoulder once. "If you find something tangible," he said, "bring it to me." Quietly. Then he walked off. That was my first confirmation. I wasn't imagining things. The company knew something was wrong, but not enough to act, or maybe too much to act openly. That afternoon, I made a decision. I would go back to the house, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed the truth. Without truth, you can't make clean decisions. After work, I drove by again. Same street, same leaning mailbox, same quiet. But this time, the blinds weren't drawn. Blake was sitting at the table, head in his hands. The red folder lay open beside him, papers spilling like a confession he didn't want to read. He looked defeated, the kind of defeated that doesn't happen overnight. A glass sat next to him. Whiskey. Not expensive, not cheap. Mid-tier, like a man trying to save money without admitting he needs to. He rubbed his forehead, then his eyes, as if the problem on the table wouldn't stop following him across state lines. I stepped back, moved to the alley again. From the side window I could see more. Not clearly, just outlines, shapes, movement. But enough. On the kitchen counter were 2 laptops. Not work laptops, personal ones. One newer, one older and dinged up. External drives beside them. A small scanner. Stacks of envelopes. He wasn't hiding from the company. He was operating a separate life. A life built on documents. The back door suddenly opened. Blake stepped out into the yard, pacing, phone in hand. I said, "I am working on it," he hissed quietly. No, I can't move more money yet. The accounts are frozen. Do you understand what that means? I froze, listening. Yes, I know they're waiting for the report. I told you. I need time. If they review the controls again, they'll... He broke off, lowering his voice. Then he said a sentence that turned my blood cold. I didn't expect him to start digging. Him. Me. I took a step back, breath shallow. He knew someone was looking. Maybe not me specifically, but he knew eyes were on him. He ended the call abruptly and stood still in the yard, shoulders tight, like a man cornered by a problem he built himself. I retreated quietly, careful not to draw attention. Driving home, my thoughts weren't scattered. They were painfully organized. Blake was hiding because he'd moved money. Blake was hiding because someone else was involved. Blake was hiding because whatever he'd done had reached a point where he wasn't in control anymore. And the company? They'd let him walk out before the fallout hit. I got home, locked the door, made coffee I didn't need, and spread out my own notes. The memos I'd saved, the logs I'd archived, the spreadsheets I'd rebuilt. I flipped back through the vendor emails, the irregular timestamps, the approval overrides. I saw it clearly now. This wasn't a simple cost overrun. This was a funnel, a siphon, a structured bleed through smaller channels, always small enough to justify, never large enough to flag automatically. Someone had guided the money. Blake had approved it, and I had cleaned the aftermath without knowing what I was scrubbing. For months, I thought I was rebuilding a damaged project. Now I understood. I'd been repairing the surface while the rot spread underneath. I leaned back in my chair. That brief moment of clarity, that microsecond where everything clicks, hit me so hard I had to set my hands flat on the desk to steady myself. The woman at the house, the deleted invoice, the frozen accounts, the person on the phone pressuring him. This wasn't about Blake losing control. This was about Blake answering to someone he never should have trusted. And then the next realization hit. If he suspected someone was digging, he'd start looking. He'd start asking. He'd start remembering who had access, who understood patterns, who had been inside the project long enough to see things others couldn't. The person cleaning his mess was now the biggest threat to the secret underneath it. As I sat there in the dim light of my kitchen, it settled in fully. I wasn't following the trail anymore. I was on it. I didn't wait for the danger to come to me. The moment I realized Blake knew someone was digging, I understood two things clearly. He wasn't smart enough to cover everything, but he was desperate enough to try anything, and desperate people with ruined careers and frozen accounts don't play fair. They don't stay predictable. They don't stay rational. I needed answers, real ones, verifiable, documented, not assumptions and shadows in kitchen windows. So the next morning, before work, I drove back to that street, not to confront him, but to observe, to see if he'd make a move. His car was gone. The house was still, curtains drawn, lights off, too quiet. I waited 3 minutes, then walked down the block like someone out for a morning run. When I reached his driveway, I didn't stop. I just glanced. A package sat on the porch, medium-sized, plain brown, no company branding. But the label mattered. It wasn't addressed to Roth. It was addressed to him. Full name, Blake Carver. At the address he wasn't supposed to be living at, meaning the house wasn't a temporary hideout. It was home, and someone knew where to reach him. I kept walking, turned the corner, and got back into my car. My pulse was steady, my mind sharper than it had been in months. At work, I didn't go to my desk. I went to the archive room. Most people hate the archive room. Cold, dusty, rows of boxes that all look the same. But for someone like me, someone who reads patterns like other people read faces, archives are gold. I looked at the old vendor audit protocols, cross-checked against the dates Blake was managing the consolidation. Then something new surfaced. A vendor contract amendment Blake had pushed through 3 days before he left. Small, quiet, disguised as a payment cycle adjustment, but the legal language, it was wrong. There was a clause that allowed third-party subconsultants to bill supporting review tasks through the vendor system if authorized by the project lead. The project lead was Blake, meaning the external compliance consultant could have billed through the vendor, invisible to most internal reports, except for the ledger I'd found. I didn't have proof yet, but the shape of the crime was forming. I was putting the pieces together when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another buzz. A text. Stop looking. It's not your fight. No signature. No threat. Just instruction. I stared at the screen, eyes narrowing. The message didn't sound like Blake. He didn't do subtle. He did bravado, charm, denial. This voice was different. Level, controlled, professional. Someone who'd worked with information before. And then another text came through. He's not the one you should be worried about. My pulse sharpened. Not panic, but focus. I walked calmly to the stairwell where no one would overhear and dialed the number back. It rang once, twice, then connected, but no one spoke. "Who is this?" I asked. Silence, then a click. The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, realizing exactly what that silence meant. Blake wasn't operating alone. He was working under someone who knew I was getting close, someone who had access to numbers, phones, maybe more, and they didn't want loose threads. That same afternoon, Carter called me into a conference room, the kind of room where promotions and terminations happen. Neutral carpet, big table, frosted glass. "You wanted to show me something?" he asked. I closed the door. "I can prove the missing vendor disbursement wasn't a technical issue," I said. "It was intentional." He didn't look surprised. He just motioned for me to sit. "What do you have?" I laid the documents down one by one. The bogus amendment, the time-stamped ledger, the invoice deletion metadata, a list of vendors who suddenly stopped responding during Blake's last month. Carter reviewed everything with the same blank calm he always had, but I saw the subtle tightening in his jaw. "This isn't a mistake," I said. "He funneled money, or access, or both. And where do you think the funnel leads?" I hesitated only a moment. "To someone he's meeting, off-site." Carter nodded once slowly. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't confused. He already had suspicions. "I need to know something," I said. "Why wasn't Blake investigated when he left?" Silence. A long, careful silence. Finally, Carter leaned back. "Because someone above me made sure he wasn't." I exhaled quietly. That wasn't corporate oversight. That wasn't HR incompetence. That was protection from higher up. "Ethan," he said, lowering his voice, "you're in dangerous territory." "I know. I'm not telling you to stop, but I'm telling you to be smart." I left the conference room with two realizations. Blake hadn't betrayed just the company. Someone inside the company had a reason to keep him untouched. That evening I drove to Blake's house again. Not to spy, not to watch, but to confront. Carefully, controlled, on my terms. But when I turned the corner onto his street, my foot froze on the brake. His car was there. But the front door was wide open. The porch light was on. A bag of groceries spilled across the steps. Rolling apples scattered like someone dropped them while running. I pulled over, heart steady, eyes scanning. No police tape. No neighbors standing around. No flashing lights. Just silence. Real silence. I approached slowly, staying to the side of the path. "Blake?" I called out quietly. No answer. Inside the doorway, the entryway light flickered. The red folder lay on the floor. Pages spilled everywhere. A chaotic fan of documents, receipts, statements, notes. The laptops were gone. Every external drive was gone. The woman's mug from the day before was shattered on the tile, and Blake was nowhere. Not in the kitchen, not in the living room, not down the hall. Just absence, and the echo of a struggle that didn't last long. I stepped back onto the porch. pulse rising, and looked out toward the street. A car engine turned over somewhere nearby. A dark sedan, the same one I'd seen before. It rolled away slowly, headlights off, and in that moment I understood the full weight of what I'd walked into. I wasn't following a corrupt manager anymore. I was standing in the middle of someone else's damage. Someone who didn't leave loose ends. Someone who knew my name. Someone who had already warned me once. And now, I'd crossed their line. I didn't call the police. People think calling the police fixes things. It doesn't. Not in cases like this. Not when the evidence is scattered, the motives hidden, and the players smarter than a patrol report. Instead, I stepped outside, stood on the porch, and let my breathing slow. You cannot think clearly while standing inside someone else's panic. The sedan was gone. The street was still. I walked back inside Blake's house, this time carefully without touching anything I didn't have to. The red folder was a disaster on the floor, but even chaos has patterns. I crouched and scanned every page without lifting a single one. A banking summary, a vendor routing sheet, a handwritten note with numbers circled, account balances, dates, amounts. And one page stood out, a ledger entry with a company name that had appeared nowhere in our internal system. Not a vendor, not a contractor, not a consultant, a shell corporation. Registered 6 months before the consolidation project began. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was choreography. I took out my phone and photographed every page exactly as it lay, not moving anything, not cleaning up the scene, just capturing what existed before someone came back for it. Then I stepped out, locked the front door behind me out of habit, even though the lock barely held, and walked straight to my car without looking back. This wasn't about Blake anymore. It was about whoever was behind him. But Blake mattered for one reason. He was the only person who could confirm the next step, and right now, he was missing. I drove home, printed the photos, organized them into their own folder, and didn't sleep. Not because I was scared, because I was building the full picture. At 7:30 the next morning, I walked into the office. Carter was already there. He always is on the last week of the quarter. He looked up the moment I entered. "You found something." "I found everything," I said quietly. I shut his door, placed the printed photos on the table, and talked him through every detail. The shell company, the missing invoice, the payment routing, the red folder, the woman, the sedan, the house under a false name, the deleted metadata, the fraudulent clause. Carter didn't interrupt. He didn't blink. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "This goes above me." He said it the way a man says something he wished he didn't know. "Above you?" I asked. He nodded once. "You're not wrong about Blake being protected, but you're wrong about who protected him." "Then who?" Carter straightened, the kind of posture shift that comes before a decision. "The CFO." My stomach tightened. Not shock, recognition. The CFO had pushed hardest for consolidation. He'd hated the risk delays. He'd signed Blake's exit package. He'd insisted on no investigation to preserve morale. It wasn't protection. It was self-preservation. "You need to take this to legal," Carter said. Not quietly, formally, with timestamps. "And Blake? If he's smart, he's running. If he's not..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I left Carter's office and walked to legal, folder in hand, heart steady. When I sat in front of the senior counsel and placed the documents on the table, she didn't smile, didn't breathe, didn't shift. She read, then she stood. "Stay here," she said. Within 5 minutes, the general counsel entered, then internal audit, then a member of the board's risk committee. My folder sat in the center of the table like a fuse. They asked questions. I answered each one cleanly. I explained only what I could prove, nothing more. No speculation, no drama. "Do you have the originals?" the GC asked. "No," I said honestly, "but I know where they were." Were? The house was ransacked when I arrived. No one said it, but everyone understood. Whoever Blake was working for had realized he'd become a liability. Audit moved fast, faster than I'd ever seen. Legal opened a file. The board demanded a preliminary briefing within 48 hours. The CFO was placed on administrative leave by the end of the day. Not accused, not named, but removed. Quietly, professionally, decisively. That night, as I left the office, my phone buzzed. A single text from an unknown number. "You should have stayed in your lane." I didn't reply. I screenshotted it. I forwarded it to legal. They responded in less than a minute. "Documented, thank you." The next morning, internal audit asked me to walk them through every control I rebuilt. They listened. They took notes. They asked for copies of my independent logs, the ones I kept because I never trusted Blake's version of events. By the end of the week, they called me into a glass meeting room. "We're recommending you for interim project oversight," the chair said. "You kept better records than the people paid to manage them." It wasn't a promotion. Not yet. But it was trust. The real kind. The kind built on receipts, not compliments. As I left the room, Carter caught up to me. "You did the right thing," he said. "I didn't do it for hero points." "I know," he replied. "That's why it worked." 2 weeks passed. The CFO resigned suddenly, for personal reasons. A quiet exit, no fanfare. But everyone who needed to know, knew. As for Blake, he was never found in town again. No one filed a missing person report. No one asked questions. Those who knew him pretended they'd never liked him anyway. Whatever deal he thought he had with the wrong people. It ended the only way those deals ever do. I won't romanticize it. I don't celebrate it. I just understand it. One night, months later, I drove past that street again. The house was empty. Porch light off, mailbox fixed, for sale sign up. I rolled down my window, took one last look, and let the past sit exactly where it belonged, behind a door I'd never open again. Life moved forward in clean lines. I got a quiet title change on my role, a raise, more responsibility, not glory, stability. My desk was my own again. My projects were clean. And for the first time in a long time, my work felt like work, not triage. On a Friday afternoon, as I packed up my bag, Carter stopped by again. "You ever wonder how it all would have gone if you'd ignored it?" he asked. "No," I said, "because that's not who I am." He nodded once. "Good. Keep it that way." On the way home, engine humming, windows cracked, the city quiet around me, I understood the real ending. Justice isn't loud. It isn't cinematic. It doesn't make speeches. It's a balance sheet. You put the truth on the table. You remove the people who corrupted it. You rebuild what needed rebuilding, and you let the rest fall where it falls. Some men run, some men hide. Some men answer for the damage they caused. My job was never revenge. My job was precision. And in the end, precision ended the people who relied on chaos. I didn't follow Blake to ruin him. I followed him to close the file. Now it's closed, completely.